All right, everybody, you just tuned into Random Radio. Welcome to the first official episode of the Just Ask podcast. Now, Just Ask is a program that we've done before in live events, but today we decided to launch it as a podcast. Figured we'd hop into the electronical world and step it up a notch. So we are going to be doing this podcast on the regular, weekly, new episodes, once a week. The idea behind the Just Ask show is we take questions from anybody and everybody about any subject at all in the whole world that you want to know the answers to. Now, I will go through all of these questions and I'll pick out what I think are very, very interesting questions, or questions that if we get multiple people send me the same question over and over and over again, well, I want to answer that question, so we're going to do it. Then I will research the subject for as long as I possibly can, take the knowledge I have and the research I've been able to find, and we will do a whole podcast on it. The whole point of this podcast is it's a show by the people and for the people. You guys come up with the questions, I do the research, and I do the podcast, but I want to answer the questions that you guys want to know about, and that's the fun part of this. So today is technically our first pilot episode, and I want to say a couple of things. First off, again, we're brand new, and we're going to have some technical difficulties right from the beginning. I'm working on getting better mics and better equipment, so the first couple episodes you may notice a glitch here or there. Just give me some leeway. It'll be okay. Trust me. The podcasts themselves will be great. You'll love them, and enjoy. Second, I got to say this, and I will say this at the beginning of most of my podcasts. Everything on these podcasts is 100% based off of my opinion, and my opinion alone. It's based off of the information I know, the information I've been able to find out through research and other means, and accumulated to do this show. So I can't stress this enough. If you don't like my opinion in the show, feel free to just change the channel. Click a different podcast on your phone. It's totally okay, guys. We live in a modern age, and there's literally thousands of podcasts out there for you to listen to. If you don't like what I have to say, there's absolutely no reason you have to listen to me whatsoever. I mean, who wants to listen to this voice all the time anyway? That being said, if you do like what we have to say and you do like the show, thank you for listening, and I think you're going to enjoy it. I think we're going to do a lot of fun. Right out the gate, we've got a bunch of fun podcasts that you're going to really enjoy. We're going to be launching a couple episodes rapid fire real quick, just so you guys get a little taste of what we got going on. And I'm going to do an episode today that's just a little nibble of what the podcast is going to be like. So I think you guys will enjoy it. We got a lot of crazy questions right out the gate, and please send me your questions. If you have questions you want answered, send them to random@cafestimulus.com. Send them to me in the comments. Send me questions through our Patreon account, which, if you like the podcast and you want to support us, go to the Patreon account for us and support us a little bit. You can send the questions any way you like. If I get them and I look at them and they're good questions, I will absolutely do a podcast on them. We are live at Cafe Stimulus in beautiful Durango, Colorado. If you're ever in Durango and you want a delicious cup of coffee or a tasty treat, come on in and check it out. It's a great place, and I might be here myself, and you might be able to get your question answered in person. But for today, our question, I didn't have anybody we just set this up, so I didn't have anybody to email me questions quite yet, so I figured the best way was just to hit the streets and ask some people what questions they would like answered. Now, the way I did it, granted, probably was a little abrupt, so I got a bunch of silly, weird, kind of like, here you go, here's an answer, and I get out of my face kind of questions and answers. But one that I was surprised that I heard a couple of times, because I figured we knew enough about this subject already, but was Roswell. So that's what we're going to do our podcast on today, guys. It's just going to be a little taste of the show. And, I know plenty of people know about the Roswell incident in 1947. Did aliens really crash land in New Mexico in 1947? Well, that's what we're going to do a podcast on today. I hope you enjoy it. So, where do we start? 1947, July, New Mexico. Well, let's start with something that's a huge misconception about the Roswell incident as it's known. It didn't happen in Roswell. The Roswell incident, the alien landing scenario in Roswell, didn't happen in Roswell at all. It was reported in Roswell, but it actually happened in a little town called, or outside of a little town called Corona, New Mexico, which was like 75 miles away from Roswell. It was quite a ways away, but the Air Force base that took control of the whole situation was in Roswell, and because of that, and because there was some military involved, uh, Roswell, the name, became more popular and spawned this whole legend of Roswell, New Mexico, and the aliens. That the name became synonymous with the alien landings and stuff like that. And still to this day, if you go down to Roswell, New Mexico, they have a UFO museum and a bunch of various restaurants and places like that take on the alien theme. It's quite funny considering it didn't happen there. It happened 75 miles away. But yeah, common misconception. It happened on a large farm outside of Corona, New Mexico, which is northwest of Roswell. So let's just start. Let's start with the facts that we know. Now, when I say facts that we know, I want you to remember that this happened in 1947, which is almost 80 years ago now, guys. 80 years. So when I say facts, it's kind of loose. But we'll start with the agreed upon facts. The first agreed upon fact is that on July 7th in 1947, a farmer by the name of W.W. Brazel, or Mac as he liked to be called, Mac Brazel, showed up in Roswell with some pieces of debris at the sheriff's office. He went to the sheriff and he was like, I don't know, this might be a UFO, thing. What is this? It crashed landed on this property. Now, it wasn't his property. People have been confused by this over the past. He was a foreman of a large property, this ranch called the Foster Ranch. It was a big property, and so he supposedly found this debris and drove it down to Roswell and showed the sheriff. And the sheriff contacted the Army base that was in Roswell, New Mexico, and Officer Jesse Murcell came out and met with Mac, and they went back up to Corona to the Foster Ranch and looked about the property, and that's where the story begins. But let's talk about the previous days. Now, we have a couple of different stories about the actual happenings before Brazel took down the supposed pieces of wreckage to the sheriff and to Marcel. So the first one is that there was a storm that happened 3 days prior to the 7th. It was a big lightning storm, and so Brazel went out to it was his job. He was the foreman of the property, so he went out to the property to assess damage, if there was any storm damage, and that's when he found this debris. And when he found it, he showed it to some of the neighbors that were around there, and they were like, well, you need to take this to the Army base. This looks a little strange. And so then he drove down to Roswell on the 7th and showed everybody this stuff. There's also another account that says that it was more like 3 weeks prior that this storm happened, and he went out to the property and he saw this kind of stuff. He didn't know what it was, so he just kind of brushed it aside with some other like tree limbs and things like that, and didn't think anything of it. And then somewhere around the 5th, he takes a trip down to Roswell, and he reads in the newspaper a story about a guy named Kenneth Arnold who claimed to have seen 9 UFOs up in Washington. That was this was something that kicked off a series of UFO sightings in the 1940s. It's heavily debated, the Kenneth Arnold situation, because the Kenneth Arnold UFO sighting spurred a huge number of UFO sightings, like all over the country. And people don't know whether or not that was just that whole placebo effect where this guy made a claim about seeing UFOs, so all of a sudden everybody's seeing UFOs, or if other people who had been seeing UFOs hadn't been saying anything, and we finally got a actual piloted officer to say that he had seen this stuff, and other people came forward. Both things have a tendency to happen when we're talking about UFOs, so we don't really know what the scenario was, but one of the theories when it comes to the Roswell situation is that Brazel, he went into town on the 5th and he saw a newspaper about this this pilot who had seen these UFOs in Washington. And then he was like, oh, well, something may have crashed on my property. I'm going to go get it. And then he went back to his farm, got the stuff, and then decided to take it down to join the UFO thing. We don't know if that's true. That's just a lot of theory. There's also another story that surmises that the newspaper was offering a $3,000 reward for any said proof of UFOs out there. So, if he thought he could make $3,000 back in the 40s, that, yeah, of course he would. It sounds a little far-fetched. I mean, I really don't think a newspaper would be offering $3,000 in 1947 for anything in America. That's a lot of money, and it doesn't sound like something that would happen. It doesn't sound realistic. So that's probably a bunch of hocus pocus. My point is the beginnings of why Mr. Mac Brazel brought that stuff down, and when he actually found it, and when the actual events took place as far as if there was a crash. We don't really know. Nobody witnessed a crash. Brazel just found the wreckage. So we'll just go to the next step. Like I said, this is just what we know so far. So far what we know is Mac Brazel finds some stuff on this property that he's supposed to be managing, and he takes it down and shows it to the sheriff, and the sheriff shows it to the army. He shows it to Jesse Marcel. Now, after that, Major Jesse Marcel, took the material to his base commander, William Blanchard, who's the base commander there at the Roswell, New Mexico base, because, who knows what this stuff was, but they obviously believed it was something. It is their job to, if there's a downed plane somewhere or something like that, they kind of have to report it. So Blanchard reports it to his superior, General Roger Ramey, at Fort Worth Army Airfield. And Ramey immediately orders all the material flown to Fort Worth. Immediately. So Marcel took all the material he had and he flew to Fort Worth. Now here's the tricky bit. On the next day, July 8th, 1947, the RAAF Public Information Officer Walter Haut issued a press release stating that the personnel from the field's 505th Operations Group had recovered a flying saucer, or a flying disc, which had landed near Roswell. The thing about it is, we don't know what they had. Now, the next day, another story was released saying that they had aired and it was actually just a weather balloon that they had found. Now, from here on, throughout the decades, all sorts of crazy things have happened as far as the story. But when it comes to the first military officer who was an officer at an Air Force base to look at the stuff, Jesse Marcel, his story never really changed, which was that they found something that was not a weather balloon. Now we can go into all the craziness. So, let's see. First off, the biggest problem with the Roswell story is that the government seems to have flubbed up so many times and recounted their story and came up with new stories and came up with new stories and came up with new stories that it just fueled the fire of the Roswell incident and created more and more conspiracy. That seems to be the biggest problem, which is something the military flubs up every once in a while and, says something stupid and then there's a conspiracy that happens or whatever. But the amount of times they did it with Roswell is extremely weird and suspicious. So, first thing they said was that it was a weather balloon. Now, the most popular theory, the current military accepted theory, was that it was not a weather balloon. They just said it was a weather balloon and had them take fake pictures with a weather balloon, because what had actually happened was they were working on a project called Project Mogul. Project Mogul was a secret weather balloon-like surveillance object that would float up in the atmosphere, and it was a secret radar program. So they were working on this top-secret radar program, and it crashed, and they didn't want people to know they were working on it. They didn't want the Russians to know that they were working on it, so they just said they found a weather balloon, because it was similar to a weather balloon, this object. The problem is, like I said, Officer Jesse Marcel, he has always said that the material that he originally saw and handled was unlike anything he had ever seen on Earth. And then they staged photographs. They asked him to stage photographs where they gave him broken up pieces of a weather balloon to take photos of. And you've seen these photos. They're very famous photos. It's him, and he looks like he's holding a bunch of sticks and tinfoil and tape and stuff like that. And he's got a silly look on his face. He's got that silly look on his face because those are faked photographs. Those are staged photographs. And he's unhappy about the fact that he's being asked to do this. But it's a cover story, and he was a military officer, and this was the 40s. When the military back then, your superior officer told you to do something, you did it for America. That's how it worked. So Major Jesse Marcel insists that what he originally saw and handled was not a weather balloon, and it was not any kind of thing that has to do with Project Mogul. But the United States government says that that's what it was. They say that they were working on this top secret project, Project Mogul, and that's what crashed. And they just didn't want anybody to know about it, so they took their time slowly releasing that information. Well, years later, some stories came out about people who supposedly also witnessed them removing alien bodies from the debris field. Now, these stories are highly suspicious, and honestly, we have very, 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 again, 1947, guys, long, long time ago. We have very, very little credible information when it comes to that and those stories, the removing of alien bodies. But what's weird is not that people were like, oh, yeah, and we totally saw some little green men and stuff like that. No, that's not weird at all. That's normal human craziness if this was just made up stuff. The thing that's weird about it, though, is, again, the military response. Because the military, after a few years of this stuff coming out in the 70s and the 80s, where people were now saying that they had seen or had nurses and things like that coming out of the woodwork saying that they had seen alien bodies removed, or other military personnel saying that they had witnessed alien bodies being maneuvered from Roswell to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base or Fort Worth. So none of that really surprises me. This is a very sensational story, and you're always going to have people who want attention who come out with strange stories like that. What was surprising was the government's response, and it wasn't what you expected. See, what you would expect is the government to be like, well, those are just crazy people. But they didn't do that, because there was, at this point in time, as far as I can tell, there was no, in the 70s and 80s we're talking about, and 90s, there was no actual credible information that says that bodies were removed. There was just a couple of people with hearsay and saying that they saw this or saying they saw that. There wasn't any real credible, proof of any of this. But then the government went and did something very weird, which is they then said that, oh, what people saw were these dummies that we launched sometimes, out of planes, out of the airfield. These there were these big anatomical dummies that they're painted green and they look like, little versions of people or whatever. We do it to test stuff sometimes, test, ejection and out of planes and things like that. The government said this statement. The government still maintains this statement. But why did they do that? Because as far as I can tell, that doesn't make any sense. Don't get me wrong. Those things exist. Those dummies exist. They do test things like that. Absolutely, sure. But that had nothing to do with the event that occurred in Roswell in 1947. The odds, I'm sorry, but the odds that this Operation Mogul thing crashed on this property at the exact same time, supposedly somebody else in the military coming from Roswell base or another Air Force base was doing tests on these dummies, and they also happened to crash land on the Foster farm right next to where this Project Mogul crashed, and that's what people were witnessing. That doesn't make any sense. That's ridiculous. That's a highly ridiculous statement, and it's very weird that the government would have made that claim and still to this day makes that claim that that's probably what people saw were these dummies. Why would people have seen these dummies at the same time that they found this debris? That makes no sense. That's preposterous. What that does, in my opinion, is it caused a huge backlash. So, did you guys really find aliens? Because why else would you be doing such a bad job of trying to cover it up? Also, this is 1947, guys. Like, it's a rough time. We just got out of the war with the Nazis, and now we're at war with the Russians. 2 hours to the west of Roswell, the very first atomic bomb was detonated. You had ongoing atomic research going on at various places, Los Alamos. You had captured German V-2 rockets at White Sands that they were doing testing on. They were burying atomic waste at a bunch of places in the middle of the desert. They were doing all sorts of radiation testing, all sorts of secret spy testing at Roswell and a bunch of other military bases in New Mexico. The point is, at this point in time in history, you would want anything and everything to completely distract everybody from that location. So the really, really bad PR that they had going on for decades about this Roswell situation kind of makes no sense unless they were just bad at it. And sometimes that happens, sure. But a lot of it doesn't make any sense. So those are the facts. That's what people say actually happened. That's what the United States military says actually happened. They say that, they had a project Operation Mogul. It crashed. That's what they recovered. They lied about it because they didn't want people to know at the time they were doing this research. And then they said that they also happened to be dropping randomly around New Mexico these dummies and testing ejection out of planes and things like that. And that's what the alien bodies that supposedly have been seen were. So, not great PR when it comes to the government, but that's what they say actually happened. Now let's move on to some theories. Of course, obviously, the number one theory is aliens. Just some aliens crash landed in Roswell, New Mexico, and this guy found some of the debris. And then he called the military, and the military came there and took everything and hid it away and said it was a weather balloon, and then changed their mind later to a more plausible explanation when people realized that was silly. So they just kept going with the terrible, terrible PR. That's the most popular theory. Now, we're not going to go into aliens on this podcast. This is just our pilot episode, and trust me, we are going to talk about some aliens in this show at some point in time. Lots, I imagine, many times. But right now we're just talking about Roswell in general. So we're not going to talk about Area 51 and UFOs and all that kind of stuff. We're just going to talk about the Roswell incident. So could it have been UFOs? Could it have been a UFO that crashed? Absolutely. I think that's totally possible. I think a UFO could have crashed there and aliens, and maybe aliens found or recovered. Totally possible. Theory number 2. It was a UFO, just not an alien one. So there are a couple different scenarios when it comes to this theory. The first one is that a lot of people don't know this, but the Nazis were doing a lot of research when it comes to flying machines, flying UFO-like objects. They actually had a couple of flying UFO objects that didn't fly great. The ones that we know about anyway, that are the ones that have been released to the public as far as information goes. They had some UFO research, and they were working on things like anti-gravity and things like that. Now, there are two possibilities in this theory. One is that there was a former SS scientist who now was with Russia, who wanted to cause hysteria in the United States. So he took one of these half-built UFOs that the Germans had created. Then this is where the story gets weird. Then he either really messed up a couple of apes, like shaved them and messed with their skin and drastically deformed them, or he did this to people, or he did this to something else, or he just put in some dummies or something into this remote piloted UFO, sent it over, and it crashed in New Mexico. And then you had you wanted to make the U.S. government look like a fool. You had that going on, where the U.S. government is now looking at a UFO, and Russia's over there laughing because they're like, haha, these idiots don't know what the hell they're doing. So that's one theory, is that the Russians were just making us look like fools. Another theory is that it was UFO, but it was ours. See, again, Nazis were working on UFO research, and after Operation Paperclip, after the war ended, all those Nazi scientists, most of them, came over to America to work for America. Werner von Braun, the whole Apollo program. So they were working on science from the Nazis. And if we were working on some sort of highly advanced spacecraft at the military bases in New Mexico somewhere, and it crashed, we would obviously want to cover it up. And They might have first tried to cover it up with the weather balloon story and then later tried to cover it up with a more advanced weather balloon story with the Operation Mogul thing. But either way, you wouldn't want to, as far as the American government in the 40s goes, you wouldn't want to tell people you were working on a spaceship. That's too secretive. So could have been one of ours. Totally possible. And then you have like one more theory, which is so over the years, especially in the 2000s, it has been revealed by former government and military personnel, after their 30-year gag order. A lot of people don't realize if you did anything really, really crazy, the military gives you a 30-year gag order, which means if you violate that gag order, they will put you in military prison. So they have real reason, but a few people, after the gag order is up, have said some things. And one of the things that has come to light is there are different branches of the military and the government that are secretive. And people always ask the same question to the president, usually whenever the new president comes in office. Hey, are you going to tell us what really happened with Roswell, what really happened with JFK, what really goes on with the aliens and all that kind of stuff? People don't realize the president has no access to none of that information. The president is just a figurehead, and he has very, very little information and access to information. He gets the information that the actual people who run the country want him to know, and that's about it. He is just a little guy on a stick that they can parade around and make it look like he's doing stuff important and running the country. He's not. He's essentially the Queen of England. She just looks pretty, and that's it. She doesn't run the country in any way, shape, or form, and neither does our president. He can pretend like he does, but he doesn't. So it always cracks me up when people are like, oh, gas prices are high, or oh, gas prices are low. That guy in the Oval Office, he's really doing a great job, or he's really doing a bad job. Nothing to do with them. None of that has anything to do with them. They don't make any of those choices. They just happen to be in office when you're mad or sad or happy about something. The point is, the government has shadow branches. There's billions and billions of dollars allocated to blacklisted programs in the military that almost have no transparency whatsoever. In other words, we pay for them in tax dollars, but these programs do all sorts of shady stuff that we will never ever know what is. Some of it just goes completely to waste. Sometimes they want to work on something new. I'm just going to use an example like, oh, we want to invent an invisibility cloak or whatever, and it doesn't work. They spend billions and billions of dollars and it doesn't work, and they're just like, okay, wipe the books of that and move on. This kind of stuff happens daily with the military, daily with the government. There's a ton of blacklisted programs. Now, the thing about blacklisted programs is sometimes they get out of hand. In every government, you have branches of the government that are supposed to be secret or blacklist branches. Well, sometimes these get out of hand. See, what you do is you put somebody really, really powerful in charge of this program, and then you kind of give them the free rein to do whatever they want to. And the thing about it is, even sometimes whenever the government's like, hey, we're pulling your funding or we don't want you to do that anymore, nobody who's working for those people know what's actually happening or who's in control because they're black programs. So sometimes if a program's canceled, that program will still keep going because the person in charge wants it to keep going, because the person in charge of them doesn't know that they're still doing that program because it's all black. It's all, blacklisted programs. It's all black operation programs. And the people who are working for those people, the lowers, the sergeants, the little lieutenants and stuff like that, they just work there. They just do this stuff because their superior officers ordering them to do it. They don't know any better. So one of the things that has been revealed over the last few years, especially in the 2000s, is that throughout the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s particularly, but probably realistically going up until the early 2000s, there were black op programs in the United States of America in particular, and some have said the UK, but mostly in the United States of America, to not want to reveal the fact that there are UFOs and a whole thing with aliens going on in the world. For what agenda, I have no idea why they wouldn't want people to know. But there's a million reasons why people say that the government wouldn't want us to know if there were actually aliens and we were communicating with them. But what we have been informed of is that there were these programs, these black op programs, in which actual government agents or military personnel would fake abductions and fake crashes all over the country and all over the world, with the idea of doing one of two things. I've heard two different scenarios doing one of two things. The first one is fear. They do it in foreign countries to scare the living crap out of foreign dignitaries, and they do a fake abduction of somebody and make it seem like the aliens really don't want anybody to know that there's aliens, because that makes sense. And then what happens is that person that they abducted comes down and says all this stuff, and then everybody's like, oh crap, okay, well, let's not piss the aliens off, so let's not do that. The other one is misinformation. And misinformation is always a part of the military, and it's always a part of the government. So they did a number of fake abductions and fake crash landings all over the world, in black operations, where they purposely dress up as cheesy aliens, the ones that we know, gray aliens or whatever, and purposely have cheesy spaceships and things like that, and then purposely go out and find people who are already prone to mental instability, and they do fake abductions of them, or crash in their property, or fly over their stuff with military vehicles and things, so that these people come out and say stuff crazy about aliens, and then everybody's like, oh, well, this wackadoo over here is just saying that. Obviously, aliens are fake. How come everybody that sees an alien's a weirdo? It's one of those things. And so another theory is that the Roswell incident could have just been one of those. Could have just been a misinformation, tactic to cover up all the other crazy stuff the government was doing in 1947, which was a lot of crazy stuff. But I think that's all we got for Roswell. These are all the facts. These are all the theories. I think that's going to be it. And again, this was just a little teaser, guys. I figured we'd do Roswell because it's a story that's been around since 1947, almost 80 years. You've heard it. You know a lot of the information, but maybe you learned a little bit about the Roswell incident today. What do I believe? What do I believe actually happened? Truth is, I have no idea. 1947 was so long ago. I have no idea. I have no idea what could have happened in Roswell. It could have been any one of those scenarios that I mentioned. I think the likelihood is it was probably one of the two most probable scenarios, which is either it was just an alien spaceship that crashed and they took it away and they did some research on it. That seems probable. It's, it happened a lot. It always cracks me up when people talk about Roswell. Roswell is the first major UFO crash in the United States. No, it wasn't. First off, UFOs have been crashing all over the planet for thousands of years, but we're not going to get into that. But as far as the U.S. goes, go back a little bit farther. You got the town of Aurora and the Aurora UFO incident. Do some research on that one, and I would love to do a podcast on it later on. That one's crazy. That one's a crazy, crazy story. I definitely suggest you research that one a little bit. It's way more interesting than Roswell. But so it was either an alien, in my personal opinion. It was either, just a UFO crash, no big deal, blah, blah, blah. Or, like I said, the military was probably working on some sort of new technology and it crashed. Not Operation Mogul. I don't buy that for a second. I don't think that's what that was. You guys made, even the officer, the major in charge has admitted that you guys made him do those terrible faked staged photos with a weather balloon there. So I don't think it was Mogul. I think you were working on something much more interesting, and maybe that crashed. It was either a UFO or an interesting military project that they were working on. Those are my two theories. It's one of those two things, but who knows? We will probably never know. Like I said, it's almost 80 years ago now, and it's just going to keep getting farther and farther away. So, moving on, I think that's going to be it for us today, guys. And I'm glad you joined us for our first pilot episode. Like I said, we're going to have a lot of fun here. We're going to answer all sorts of crazy, wacky questions. So if you have a question for me, once again, please feel free to send it to my email at random@cafestimulus.com. I've been your host, Nicholas John Random. If you like our podcast, you know how it works, guys. Click that like button down there at the bottom. Send some comments over to me with some good questions. If you'd like to support us a little bit, help us keep the lights on, get us some better mics and things like that, head over to our Patreon account at patreon.com/randomradio. You can send me a question through Facebook, facebook.com/randomradiopodcast. We're on there. If you guys want to send some questions or some love that way, we're absolutely there. We have once again been live at the Stimulus Cafe and Coffee House in beautiful Durango, Colorado. Come in anytime for a delicious cup of coffee. It's a great place, super quiet and cool. And that's going to be it for us today, guys. So thanks for joining us, and we'll catch you next time on the next episode of Just Ask.